Okay, we talked about,
But now he works for Constellation.
Okay.
He left my company.
Okay. All right.
He's
That's so funny.
we had
I'm gonna see him later. I'll tell him.
okay, please do. Tell him I said hi.
I will for sure.
We had like he worked there first. And when I first went down, he like drove me around and like showed me all the
How
cool
nice
spots
is
to
it?
go
It's
to.
very
It was
simple.
so nice.
And he has a superpower. We were talking about like when the pandemic hit. Like
Hello,
crisis of any kind.
and
Just do whatever he wants to.
Oh really? What did he do? Maybe like
Lived in an
Mississippi?
island. You know, lived in an island.
it's good.
Doesn't he have family?
His
Hello,
husband-
and welcome to Politics and Prose bookstore. My name is Claire McGuire, and I'm a supported events bookseller here. We now host in-person and virtual events along with partnered and supported events, trips, and classes. You can't hear? He's recording, so. Okay, we'll start again. Is this better? Great. Okay, that's good. My name is Claire McGuire, and I'm a supported events bookseller here. We now host in-person and virtual events, along with partnered and supported events, trips, and classes. For a full list of confirmed events, please go to our website, politics-prose.com. Before we get started today, I'd like you to please silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. When we get to the time for opening the floor to your questions, we've placed a standing microphone at the end of the aisle to your right. Please line up at the mic so that everyone can hear your question, as we want that question to be heard in our audio recording of the event. We are live streaming today's program, and you or anyone you know can also soon find it at the Politics and Prose YouTube channel. Following the Q&A, we'll have a signing up here at this table, so if you have not already purchased the book, we have many copies behind our registers at the front of the store. We will ask you to line up starting here at the pillar. We will also come by the line to ask your name for personalization, so please have your books ready for us. So now, without further ado, I'm very excited to welcome retired Senator Jeff Bingaman of New Mexico to discuss his book, Breakdown: The Lessons for a Congress in Crisis. We are really appreciative of his willingness to reschedule this event from its original date in November so that we could all hear him in person. In his 30-year career representing the citizens of New Mexico in the U.S. Senate from 1983 to 2013, Jeff Bingaman witnessed great things accomplished through the legislative process. He also had a front row seat for the breakdown of governing norms and the radical increases in polarization and partisanship that now plague what was once called the world's greatest deliberative body. Slowing climate change is an important goal for Bingaman, and he laments Congress's inability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. He writes, "To date, policymakers have failed to recognize the extent of the risks posed by climate change, and special interests have been largely successful in resisting bold changes in policy." Breakdown traces the development of congressional dysfunction over more than 3 decades and provides 8 case studies that examine how the crisis affects our government's ability to meet major policy challenges. We didn't always have a Senate that failed in its basic public obligations, including catalyzing a robust economy, confronting climate change, improving health care, fixing education, preserving hublands, and avoiding unnecessary wars. We do now. Senator Bingaman is a native of Silver City, New Mexico. He attended Harvard College and Stanford Law School. He then joined the U.S. Army Reserve from 1968 to 1974 and was elected as the New Mexico Attorney General from 1979 through 1982. In the Senate, he served on the Finance Committee, the Armed Services Committee, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, the Joint Economic Committee, and the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, where he served as its chair. He and his wife Ann live in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Bingaman will be joined in conversation by Dana Milbank, a nationally syndicated op-ed columnist for the Washington Post. He has also been a contributor to CNN and MSNBC, and is the recipient of the White House Correspondent Association's Beckman Award and the National Press Club's Gingras Prize. Dana is the author of several national bestsellers, including The Destructionists and Homo Politicus, as well as Tears of a Clown, O is for Obama, and Smash Mouth. He lives in Washington, D.C. Please welcome Senator Bingaman, Dana Milbank.
Hello. It's good to see a huge crowd out here on a Saturday afternoon.
I agree. This is amazing.
Well, it's wonderful to be with you. I have for many, many years been an admirer of this man, and the way I showed it was with my highest compliment by not writing about him.
I appreciate that. I hope that keeps up.
And that is, it is true, because my job is to point out all the people who are screwing things up in town, and there's just a long list of them. Norm Ornstein wrote the introduction to the book, and he said Jeff Bingaman was a model senator, not a show horse, but a workhorse. I don't know if you like being called a horse of any sort, but if we had 100 Jeff Bingamans, or even 51 Jeff Bingamans, we wouldn't be in this mess we're in. I'd take even like a couple dozen Jeff Bingamans.
Right.
I thought you probably know this man. If you're here right now, you probably know him quite well, so I'm not going to burden you with further introduction, but I was hoping you could sort of outline what you've written. You've diagnosed the problem. He came here in what, in retrospect, were the good old days when things actually functioned. Midway through Ronald Reagan's first term, you've known giants like Tip O'Neill, presidents from Reagan through Obama. Spent 26 years working elbow to elbow with some guy named Joe Biden. And you've known some giants of another sort like Newt Gingrich. So the senator has, diagnosed what went wrong, and he's also given a few recommendations for how to fix things. And I'm particularly interested in that because I'm always asked, how do you fix things? And I filibuster.
Right.
I give a big shrug. So, give us a talk. I've got some questions, and then afterwards we'll have anybody here who wants to line up and ask some questions as well.
Well, Dana, thank you very much, and thank you for agreeing to do this conversation with me. I look forward every week to reading your column, and you shed great light on, for those of us who live out in the hinterland, for the inner workings of Washington, and I appreciate it very much. And also, I've had occasion to read your latest book, and frankly, everything I talk about in here is covered in your book, virtually. And
but you need to buy both of them.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Frankly, your book covers a lot of other things that I hadn't been that focused on. But let me also thank Norm Ornstein. Norm did the foreword to the book, and any of you who get a chance should look at that foreword. It's even if you don't like the book, the foreword is terrific. What I try to do in the book is sort of four different things. The first chapter is devoted to what I call the breakdown in congressional governing norms, and I just mentioned four specific cases. And they're on the front of this sheet. And any of you have this yellow sheet that I passed out. Shutting down the government, threatening default on the debt, abusing the right to filibuster, and refusing to consider a Supreme Court nominee. Obviously, the first two of those, shutting down the government and threatening default on the debt, are pretty much in the news today, or at least the threatening default on the debt is, and I think shutting the government will be when we get into September. Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting to go back to the beginning of that and talk about Gingrich's ascension to the speakership and how he really did see this as a legitimate, I believe he thought it was legitimate, way for Congress to use additional or gain additional leverage over the president. And here his statement on this is, I think, fairly instructive, where he says if you're going to operate with the president's veto being the ultimate trump, then you have to operate within a very narrow range of change. So we had to find a Trump to match his Trump, and the right not to pass money bills is the only Trump that's equally strong. So his view of how the founding fathers, I guess, intended the government to work is that if you had disagreements between the Congress and the president, it was well within the rights of the Congress to just shut everything down. Lamar Alexander had a quote that was in the New York Times, I believe. I took this from an article in the Times that I thought was much more my thinking, where he said shutting down the government should never ever be used as a bargaining chip for any issue, period. It should be to governing as chemical warfare is to real warfare. It should be banned. It should be unthinkable. So I guess what really sort of got me thinking we had a problem in the functioning of the Congress was when we started the shutdowns in late 95, early 96, and then they continued. And of course, the indoor record for shutdowns was Trump's thing in 2018, where he decided to shut down the government because Congress wouldn't appropriate the money he wanted for the border wall. So at any rate, that's those four specifics, and we can get into any of the others that you're interested in, but there were those specific breakdowns in congressional governing norms is the first part of the book. Then I talk about what I call the 5 impediments to serving the public interest, and these are pretty obvious. Ideology, and I give some examples of how that anti-government ideology, I think, sort of came to permeate a lot of what was going on in Washington, it seemed to me. Pressure from special interests, that increased dramatically. Pressure to vote the way the polls dictate, that's sort of an unfortunate side effect of all the new technology polling that we have available. Pressure to toe the party line, which is probably as great as it's ever been in my experience. And then the media is a big part of the problem. Because the definition of the media has dramatically increased since I was serving here 10 years ago, and so all of these are, as I say, they're impediments to serving the public interest. I start with the proposition, which some of you may disagree with, that most people who come to Congress intend, at least one of their motivations is they want to serve the public interest. And for those who do have that as a motivation, it's more difficult, I think, to do that today than it was before these impediments became so great. Then these eight worthy efforts, the people's business, those are case studies of issues that we struggled with during the time I was in the Senate. I think they're still being struggled with. I think they're all very much issues that are alive, and in some cases we made a little progress for a while, and in other cases we fell flat in our face and didn't make much progress. But I discussed those, and then as you suggested, I've got some suggestions both for how to fix the problems of Congress, these 4 breakdowns in congressional governing norms, but also some sort of common sense suggestions for members about how they could overcome some of these and do a better job of working together and serving the public interest. So that's the whole book, and any of you have a chance to look at it, I think it would be great.
All right. Well, thank you for that overview. You noted in the book and just a moment ago that the media is one of the impediments, and I say guilty as charged, so it is my fault. But I wanted to drill down on that a bit, and I think one of the major changes in the decade since you left I mean, there have been huge changes in the media generally, but particularly social media becoming so dominant, and also disinformation. Now, this has always been around, and your entire time in politics, there's been disinformation, but it seems to be so pervasive now that a large segment of the population is operating in a totally different reality. And I'm wondering, how can a legislature function? How can a legislator function in such an environment? Like, I imagine you can't even recognize what's going on there right now.
Well, you're right. I think disinformation or false information is very prevalent, and you point out in your book, and I also point out in the one I wrote, that things like the death panels, when we were trying to pass the Affordable Care Act, the claim that this would lead to or would enact the authority for the government to have death panels. I encountered that in New Mexico. I did some town hall meetings that summer before the issue came up for a vote, and there were a lot of people there who were very irate about the idea that the government was getting ready to have death panels in place to, as Chuck Grassley said, to pull the plug on grandma. I think that was his phrase. So the disinformation has been there a long time, the false information, and unfortunately, a lot of the media just takes it and runs with it. Yeah. So I wish I could tell you how to solve that problem, but it's become a more and more significant problem for anybody in Congress to try to deal with.
You had I think a nice quote from Lamar Alexander in there, and that got me thinking a little bit. I mean, there's still a number of people you served with who are still there in the Senate, in the Congress generally. It's a question I get a lot, and I'd like to put it to you because you know so many of these people and people like them who you served with. All of our politics has become radicalized, particularly so over the last decade. And I look at people in the Senate and I say, surely they have to know better. And so what I'm wondering is it all a game? Do you think that they have convinced themselves, I'm talking about the MAGA republicanism, have they convinced themselves that what they're saying is right? My thinking has always been, well, they might say it to go along, to get along, but ultimately you just keep saying it, you start to believe it. But do you think that, are they like secretly, if you gave them truth serum, would they say, I just can't wait for this all to go away so we can be normal again?
Well, I think people, particularly on the Republican side, are under tremendous pressure to not get too far out of line with some of these radical positions that, at least from my perspective, radical positions. I think that they want to be reelected. They want to win their next primary. They don't want to have Donald Trump attacking them and various other folks attacking them, and so they either go along or keep their mouth shut, basically, and in that way go along. So I don't know. I think there's probably a lot more of that than there is ardent belief in these points of view. I think that political survivor, people who want to be political survivors, I think are pretty well attuned to when they should shut up and when they should speak up, and unfortunately, I think a lot of people on the right have decided they just need to shut up and let it happen.
Mm-hmm. But at least maybe underneath it somewhere there's still some.
Yeah, I think so.
That's hopeful.
I hope that's right. I think it is.
A lot of your suggestions in here involve rules changes and possibly at least a carve-out filibuster, if not an outright abolition of the filibuster. I think I'd be safe in saying you were and probably are an institutionalist. I don't know if you were always, have you changed your view on the filibuster? And what is, what's your message to Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema? I mean, at the moment it doesn't matter because there's a Republican House, but from somebody who I think it's fair to say is an institutionalist, what's the case to be made on the filibuster and other rules changes?
Well, I think that, say, on the issue of raising the debt ceiling, to me that's eminently logical to say a filibuster does not apply to any proposal that involves raising the debt ceiling. I mean, this is something the country's got to do, and to allow that to be filibustered strikes me as a crazy position. And I really think you've gotten to a point where Mitch McConnell can agree not to filibuster and not to have Republicans filibuster, but of course he's got Ted Cruz and various people who are going to filibuster. And so, like this thing at the end of 2021, when they, I guess they passed a separate bill which authorized the Senate to pass an increase in the debt ceiling, or not an increase, an increase in the debt ceiling without having to get the full 60 votes. So it was a workaround, but it was a clear indication to me that Mitch McConnell didn't think this made good political sense for them to be standing in the way of this. And so I don't know, but it strikes me that there's a very logical case for at least carving out an exception on the filibuster for that purpose.
Okay. In both the cases of a shutdown and the filibuster, you would discuss possible solutions, as you just did, possible rules changes, ways to tuck things into reconciliation. But it seemed to me in both cases you were saying that if all else fails with the shutdown possibility, you said to refuse to negotiate about it. And with the debt limit, you said at some point with that as well, if none of these other options for fixing it, then you said the only remedy is with the voter. So I think in both cases you're saying you can't negotiate with these hostage takers. So I mean, we're approaching another debt limit showdown. What's your view? Is it that the president should absolutely not be negotiating on this?
I don't see how negotiating in the long run helps. The truth is, President Obama did negotiate back in 2011, and we got a bunch of arbitrary cuts in spending and all, which lasted and continued for a long period. And I thought that was I say in the book that was one of the worst votes I cast, was in favor of that Budget Control Act, which was the outcome of it. And I think that fortunately by 2013, when the effort was made again, Obama stood his ground and said, "We're not going to negotiate." And I think that was the right position. That second time was the right position, and I think that ought to be the position that Biden takes this year. Is that we can't be negotiating, because this comes up every year or so. I mean, you got to raise the debt ceiling. You can't just say, okay, we're going to allow you to hold hostage an increase in the debt ceiling until we get what we want. It's just it's not a tenable long-term position for the president, any president, to take on, in my view. And on the business of shutting down the government, all the times we've seen shutdowns, none of them have had the desired effect, at least as far as I can tell. I mean, when the Congress was shutting down the government, Clinton didn't buckle under. When Obama was when the Congress was shutting down the government, Obama didn't buckle under, and when Trump shut down the government, the Congress didn't buckle under. So the whole idea that you're going to, this gives you great leverage on the other branch of government. It just there's no record to support that I can see.
Okay. You served for 6 years of the Reagan presidency. I wonder if Ronald Reagan were with us today, what do you suppose he would make of this? And what would the Republican Party make of Ronald Reagan today? That's sort of a broad picture. I'm going to see if I can get you in a little trouble.
Well,
if that doesn't work, I've got other ways.
Yeah. Well, I think Jim Baker is sort of the key person here, because I think Baker had a tremendous influence over the positions that Reagan wound up taking, and Reagan, to his credit, took Baker's advice on a lot of things, but I think he would, I think much of what is being advocated on the Republican side today is out of step with what Reagan was comfortable with, and I think that would have. I give him the benefit of the doubt and say that he would have tried to speak up and indicate that this is not what he considers conservatism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. I noticed another suggestion in there was a rule change to require a vote on a Supreme Court nominee. Obviously, it didn't come up for many of the years when you were there. You hear also proposals of courtpacking. I guess that's the derogatory way of talking about it. Are you open to radical solutions such as that? And have you evolved in terms of how strong the medicine has to be to fix the problem?
Well, I guess I am not comfortable with the idea of trying to pack the court. I think there's such a history related to that it would be very difficult to get the support to do that, and probably a mistake to ever try. That'd be my.
And you're not actually, you're talking about a carve out for the filibuster, but you're not for totally abandoning it.
Well, I would be for totally abandoning it at this point, but I think the case for the carve out, when it relates to the debt ceiling, is the strongest case. It seems to be. But I think it would make good sense at this point to eliminate the ability to filibuster in the Senate, and I say so in the book.
Okay. All right, back to trying to get you in some more trouble. From the decades you served with our current president, you know him well. How do you assess how he's doing now? The reason I'm asking this is, of course, you're constantly hearing he's too old to run for another term. I have to tell you, the Joe Biden I see today is identical to the one I saw 25 years ago. People say, assume that because he misstates something. I was like, well, that's kind of his brand. He was always that way. But I'm just wondering, how he looks to you, and do you want to get an early endorsement in here?
Well, I'm not doing endorsements, but I thought he did very well at the State of the Union speech. I thought one of the good things about it was that the commentary I saw afterwards, none of it related to his age or anything. I mean, I think he was vigorous. He was determined. He handled the heckling well, and I think a lot of people. It was hard to look at that and say this guy's not up to the job. He was up to the job that night, and generally I think he's been doing a pretty good job. I mean, he's had a lot of things thrown at him, but it's amazing to me, and he doesn't get all the credit for this. Chuck Schumer and a lot of people in Congress deserve credit, but it's amazing to me how much was done in the last couple of years legislatively.
That's true. Another one more attempt to get you in trouble here. You also served for many years with the current minority leader. What do you think Mitch McConnell's legacy will be? I think he's now the longest-serving party leader, right? I could see it. He presided over a time when things deteriorated. you could also argue that things would have deteriorated more rapidly with somebody else in that. But what do you think his legacy will be?
Well, I don't think we know yet. I think in a weird way he has come to represent the responsible position for Republicans on a lot of these issues. I mean, I don't think he is interested in seeing some kind of default on the debt this year. I think he's going to be doing what he can to head that off. I don't think he's really interested in seeing a shutdown of the government this fall. I think he's going to be doing what he can to head that off. So I think where he sort of early on in his career was more of a bomb thrower than he is today, it seems to me. And today I think he sort of feels like he's got 12 or 14 people there in the Senate who will support him in seeing to it that the railroads continue to stay on the tracks.
Okay. Could I get maybe in the big picture? I'd like to assess your optimism level that we kind of get out of the current mess. As I was writing about, we've had all these sort of iterations of this. We had the Revolution of '94. We had the Tea Party. Each one seems to take us a little further off the track, and to the point where things really aren't functioning at all. Do you see us getting out of this? Are we in some sort of a death spiral? What's just like? Could you talk in the sort of general terms about your prognosis here?
I guess my thought, and we'll see if anything comes of this, but my thought is that the most hopeful thing is what's happening at in some states, particularly the changes in the electoral system up there in Alaska. I think that was very hopeful, and the idea of going to open primaries, going to ranked choice voting. I think that has had a very positive impact on both what they've done by sending people to Congress, but also what they've done in their own state legislature. I was just reading something this morning about how various of the state legislators in Alaska who were elected through this recent election have now put together a caucus to try to work together and get some things done. So to the extent you could see that proliferate around the country, that would help a lot. I thought the other night when I was watching Marjorie Taylor Greene heckling the president that if she had to run for re-election in an open primary with ranked choice voting, she might be a little slower to be yelling liar at the president so many times. I don't know. Maybe that's wrong, but it seems to me that she would then have to answer to something that is much closer to the same constituency that Joe Biden has to answer to. The broader public rather than just a narrow sliver of the public.
So that's hopeful that change could come from outside to bring it here. What is your message to, those serving now? I'm guessing Marjorie Taylor Greene probably isn't watching the live webcast of this or whatever. Or she'll watch it later, I'm sure.
Right.
After she puts away that helium balloon she was walking around with after the Chinese spy balloon. But what is your? I think at you closed the book, in fact, with some sort of personal message with what should today's legislators be doing? I mean, maybe they can't get themselves out of this, but how can they heal themselves? What's your word to your successors?
Well, I don't have any great insight that all of them don't have. It just seems to me that the American public is not as interested in these partisan fights and polarized positions as Washington, official Washington seems to be. And to the extent that members of Congress can reflect the general sentiments of the American public, and I was encouraged by the midterm elections. I think it was something of an indication that the American public is in favor of, they were not voting for people who were election deniers and all. They were trying to support people who would get on with the business of government. And so I guess to the extent that members of Congress can pick up that message and react to it, that would be good.
You said at the very beginning that you think, and you wrote in the book, that you think most elected officials they're motivated by a desire to do things in the public interest. I think that actually generated some chuckles here.
Right.
But maybe you could talk a bit more. I mean, they may have a very different view of what's in the public interest here.
Agree.
But do you, I don't know if you want to break it down by percentages. Do you think that most of those in the Congress right now are in fact good actors in a bad situation? Are they misguided? I mean, it's a little bit easy to say, well, they're anti-democratic, supportive of an insurrection. Maybe that's overbroad. Do you give some of these folks more credit than I am, for example?
Well, I probably do. I probably give them more credit in that I do think most people, I said one of their motivations is that they would like to do something for the public interest as they define it. And it's there are very different definitions of what the public interest requires or what should be done. But my sense is that, part of the problem is once you get elected, particularly if you're on the Republican side, you then are subject to a lot of pressure to stay with the party position on a lot of different issues, and Democrats are too. There's no doubt, but it's not near as strong. I think the Democratic Party has historically been less organized and less disciplined, and that's one of the great things about it. Will Rogers' great line about not belonging to an organized political party. He's a Democrat. But I think Republicans do belong to an organized political party. And they're anxious to be reelected, and they then have a lot of pressures on them to during the campaigns they have a lot of pressures on them to take some fairly extreme political positions, and then once elected, they have a lot of pressure on them to stick with those.
All right. Well, that's ennobling and uplifting that there may be good people just stuck in a bad situation.
Well,
so.
Some of them. I'm not saying
you're not
all.
excusing all of them. No. All right. Well, I imagine some of you folks have questions for the senator. We've got a microphone behind this pole right here. So if you want to head on over, and the usual admonition applies to make a question as opposed to a speech. The senator recognizes a filibuster when he sees one.
You've been very careful not to talk about parties too much. But what do you do with a Senate leader who says, my most important job is to make President Obama a one-term president? You rarely hear Republicans saying they want to reach out across the aisle. It's just the Democrats who want to reach across the aisle, and they hit obstruction. Not another idea, just no. That's the end. What do you do about that?
Well, again, I'm a long way from what's going on here, but my impression is Chuck Schumer has been able to find ways to work with McConnell that a lot of it I don't think is in the newspaper necessarily, but one way or another, McConnell is not being the obstructionist with Chuck Schumer that he was when Harry Reid was. When I was in the Senate there, Harry Reid was pulling his hair out because he couldn't get any cooperation from the Republican leader. Chuck Schumer has succeeded some way or other in getting reasonable cooperation on a lot of issues. Not everything by any means, but I think he's done a marvelous job, and I can't give you other suggestions for what he should do. It seems to me he's doing pretty well.
Thank you.
Well, I think we got a Chuck Schumer endorsement in there.
Well, I'm impressed. I think Chuck is very capable.
And by the way, who would you say is the most effective leader you've known or you've worked with in your time in politics, of either party?
Well, there are lots of them, but I think Harry Reid was a very effective leader. I think George Mitchell was a very effective leader in the time he was the Democratic leader there in the Senate, in particular. And I think, as I say, Chuck was Harry's deputy during the last several years that I was in the Senate, and I think Chuck is doing an amazingly effective job considering what he's got to deal with.
Mm-hmm. And Kevin McCarthy. No,
well, there's another. I didn't really work with Kevin.
Thank you, Senator. I'm from San Juan County.
Oh, good.
From Farmington
Good.
High School.
Sure.
I've been here for 20-something years working in and out of Congress. Most recently with the Modernization Committee in the House. Specifically during the pandemic, I went home to live in San Juan County, and it was shocking to me, especially after January 6th, how completely disenfranchised people in general, especially rural America, felt, and how they didn't feel implicated in the consequences of January 6th or responsible for it. Maybe scorn and like Schadenfreude, they deserved it. That said, we got 202 recommendations passed in the House to bring Congress online, basically from 1870 to the modern world. I'd say right now it's stuck between sort of 8th grade and Pizza Hut. It can get on Zoom to do its business, but it can't track your pizza or legislation, and it can't do specific stuff. We've been trying to get the Senate to modernize and to take steps forward, especially on deliberation, and include Americans in lawmaking more often than in elections. And as someone who worked there for so long, like if you were still in the Senate, what would you do to start moving the Senate out of the 19th century, to include more Americans in lawmaking, for example?
Well, I don't know. I guess I would try to figure out if there's a couple of senators, preferably one Republican and one Democrat, that felt committed on this issue, and if so, try to get them to champion the position you're advocating. I mean, my simplistic view of the way things ought to work there in Congress is you get a small minority of two, one from each party, and get them to agree on something they'd like to see accomplished, and then take it from there. And it's surprising how far some of that can go.
Thank you.
Hi, Senator. My name's Bill Carey. I have a blog, The Dystopia Report. I just want to ask a question. Always been a big fan of yours, and I'm a big fan of your interviewer there. But I'd like to ask, we're talking about, it strikes me here that we're talking about governance, but I think that most in this room would agree that probably the darkest time, one of the darkest times in American history was the end of the 2020 election leading up to the to 1/6. And those of us who saw it coming sort of, could see what was formulating there. But what I want to ask you is, the adults in the room. We talk about the game and whatnot, but the adults in the room at that point, who, to my mind anyway, people could disagree, who were most responsible for reining things in were the Republican senators who, by the way, said not one thing throughout, leading up to the to 1/6 from the time election day. I encourage you to go back if you didn't pay that much attention to it, but very, very little was said by virtually anyone, any Republican senator. And my question to you is just simply, it's a very collegial, collegiality is its brand, of course, in the Senate. But I just would like to ask you, and if it's too personal, I don't want you to answer, but as someone who was a citizen at that point and a person, how disappointed were you, or what did you expect of your Republican colleagues, many of whom were your friends of long standing, who were utterly silent, and many would say, and I certainly will say, were complicit in the way things deteriorated and in taking on what was clearly the most organized coup or organized effort to overthrow American democracy probably in our history. So I'm just asking you personally, did any of your were you disappointed in them? Did you expect more of them? Did any of your relationships suffer because of it?
Well, first, I should make clear I don't have relationships with a lot of the people you're talking about. Some of them have come to the Senate since I left. Others I never had relationships with, although they were there when I was serving. But
were you horrified?
I was surprised and disappointed that we didn't have more people standing up and speaking up for getting on with the inauguration of Joe Biden and basically putting aside these allegations of problems with the election. And really, I think maybe this is again too optimistic, but I think the American public sent a pretty strong signal in the midterm elections that they are not going to be supporting people who won't get these issues behind them, and this election denial business. And I think it's not likely. I know that this may be totally wrong, but I think in 2024, I don't expect we're going to have as bad a circumstance where people refuse to accept the results of the election. Maybe I'm wrong.
So you feel that the institutions of democracy have held? Like, do you feel that the worst of it is behind us?
I think so. I think that there's still all kinds of problems, but I don't think it is going to be easy going forward for someone to gin up the public to believe that the election was stolen from them, the way Trump was able to do that after the last election.
Was there another questioner behind it? Yeah.
Hi, Senator. My name is Caleb Fulford. I am currently a college student studying in D.C. for the semester. And so personally, first, I just want to thank you for your work in the Senate. You were very famed for broadening accessibility to AP programs for low-income high school students like myself. I'm only where I am at William & Mary back in Williamsburg, Virginia, because of your work on those AP programs and because I got to take those tests as a not so financially privileged student. Now juxtapose your work in the Senate, broadening accessibility for AP programs, juxtapose that with what Governor DeSantis is doing in the state of Florida, just removing AP African American Studies, and kind of you worked to broaden education. He's working, and a lot of Republicans are using culture war issues in the classroom to diminish education. And so I just want to see what you make of some of these culture war issues that are being waged on our teachers.
Well, I think it's very unfortunate that you've got people who are basically demagoguing some of these issues and using the school system as a way to further their own political agenda. I think that's, my parents were both teachers, and I've always thought that, the people involved in teaching should be allowed to go ahead and teach, and we shouldn't have politicians telling them what to teach. And I think most people in the country probably think that, but you're right. I think it's disturbing to see what Governor DeSantis has been able to do there in Florida.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I, for one, am feeling uplifted by what you've said here today.
That's hard to believe.
I mean, I started from a low place, so, but I'm feeling somewhat better. You any closing thoughts you want to leave folks with here? Then you all got to bring your books up here for the senator to sign.
Well, thank you again for being here and agreeing to do this conversation, and keep those columns coming.
I'll do it.
Yeah, we'll keep reading them. Great. Thank you very much.